Welcome to the Ricci Flow Nutrition Podcast. My name is Cameron Borg. On this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. James Muecke. James Muecke is an Australian ophthalmologist, 2020 Australian of the Year recipient and proponent of healthy eating. After beginning his career in Kenya, Muecke returned to Australia where he became an eye surgeon and advocate for preventing blindness. He has started both Vision Myanmar and Sight for All, organisations aimed at eliminating blindness throughout the world. In 2012, James Muecke was appointed a member of the Order of Australia, and in 2019 he received the University of Adelaide's Vice-Chancellor's Alumni Award. In 2020, he was named both South Australian of the Year and Australian of the Year. James's primary focus in recent years has been on increasing public awareness of the dangers of refined food, particularly sugar. Type 2 diabetes is the largest cause of blindness in Australia and abroad, leading Dr. Muecke to focus on the preventability and reversibility of this condition when these refined foods are eliminated. I had a wonderful time speaking with James. He's extremely humble, knowledgeable, and motivated to help people achieve their optimal health. With all that being said, I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks so much for coming to talk to me, James. This is a real honour. I'd love to know how you became so interested in eyes, and in your training, what drew you to ophthalmology?
Wow, I have to wind the clock right back, Cameron. Thanks for having me on your podcast this morning. It's great to be here. I wanted to be a doctor for as long as I can remember. And there's nothing specifically during my childhood that drove me in that direction. It just was something that was in me from those early days. And certainly back when I was a child, I loved building things with my hands, making things, those model aeroplanes that we used to do. We didn't have smartphones and computer games back then, so we used to use our hands a lot. And so this combination of wanting to do medicine and then using my hands to create things and build things, surgery was the thing that obviously appealed to me, and particularly microsurgery, because I love doing fine work. I really wanted to become a microsurgeon, so I knew that from very early on. So I worked hard through high school and unfortunately was able to get into medicine. Interestingly, so I grew up in Canberra, and I was born in Adelaide, but Dad got a job with a CSIRO when I was 5. So I grew up in Canberra, went to school in Canberra, was hoping to go to Sydney with all my mates, and missed out on Sydney University by 1 mark for medicine there. So I ended up coming to Adelaide, which was great because there are a lot of family and friends here. So I did medical school here, but worked my butt off during medical school to then get into surgical training. So surgery, I knew there was the thing that was appealing to me, and I said microsurgery. So there were 3 main things that were particularly interesting. So neurosurgery, plastic surgery, and eye surgery, ophthalmology. And in the end, it could have been any one of those 3 really. My internship, I was exposed to surgical training, and particularly neurosurgery, and I just didn't like the culture and the environment. So ophthalmology was then the thing that was particularly appealing to me. But interestingly, at that stage, towards my end of my medical degree and certainly into my internship, I just needed a change because I'd just worked so hard through medical school, through high school before that, and then during my internship, it was a real slog and just needed a break. And I think the other interesting thing was during my internship, this was my first year of really being able to practice medicine, but I was mainly just encountering people in the public hospital who had self-inflicted diseases. So they were generally chronic diseases. Back then in the 80s, it was mainly smoking related, but we were just starting to see some diet related diseases coming through. Type 2 diabetes was really starting to emerge. So becoming a little disillusioned, only being able to alleviate symptoms, prolong life, really not being able to reverse, let's say, or to cure a patient. And my personality as such probably can gather from liking the building projects that I used to do using my hands. I really like to have an outcome. And so, what I was exposed to during my internship really wasn't that appealing as a career in medicine. So I was starting to think and explore other opportunities. And during medical school, I was doing some projects as well. I actually started making furniture, designing and building furniture. And I was even considering dropping out of medicine to go to Milan, actually, to study furniture design. And so that was a big kind of sliding door moment in my life. But I also had been exposed to a period of time in Kenya, in Africa, as a medical student doing my elective, and I came across this hospital that really appealed to me, that one day I should come back and have a stint working there. So during my internship, I thought, well, okay, I'm going to take this opportunity to go to Africa and spend this year working as a voluntary doctor in this little hospital in the mountains of central Kenya. And that was a truly life-changing experience. I absolutely loved that year. This was now an opportunity to treat patients who didn't have self-inflicted diseases. In fact, chronic diseases, I don't think I even saw. I only took out the the ECG machine, the heart tracing machine, once during that entire year. So mainly infectious diseases, TB, malaria, delivering babies through cesarean sections and a bit of trauma. So it was very, very satisfying for me, and it reinvigorated a love of medicine, and it also installed in me a desire to pursue a career in public health. And so then combining that new interest of mine, the opportunity to use my hands through microsurgery and to have an opportunity to cure blindness. Cataract is the leading cause of blindness in the world. It's a very straightforward operation to restore someone's sight. That culmination of those three things really then said to me, ophthalmology is the thing for me to do. So fortunately, I'd set up some opportunities before I left to Africa, and whilst I was in the hospital in Kenya, I received a phone call from the head of ophthalmology at the Royal Adelaide Hospital asking me to come and join the training program. So that's what I did. I returned to Adelaide in 1990 to take up a career in ophthalmology. And so it's been an amazing experience. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it's not an easy, straightforward thing that I can tell you.
No, it's a wonderful story, and I'm glad you told the whole arc, because it really puts it into perspective. But you've become known now a champion of awareness about the danger of refined sugars, particularly for ocular pathologies. Was there any point in your career where that sort of really showed itself to you? Like, when did you start to realize that these refined food products were starting to be devastating to eye health?
Yeah, loss of vision and blindness is the most feared complication of type 2 diabetes. And so I've been an eye surgeon and ophthalmologist for over 30 years. I think it's something like 31 years now. And I've been dealing with the blinding consequences of this disease for my entire career, but only really seeing myself as the guy at the end of the line dealing with the complications, trying to stop people going blind and trying to restore vision. So I never had thought about it that deeply, that these critical conversations about diet were really up to the general practitioner, the nutritionist, the dietitian. So it wasn't something that I'd really ever thought about too deeply. I just thought that was happening. In late 2018, I was involved in creating a little documentary about the experience of blindness, what it means to be blind. And I chose 10 people, 4 of whom were born blind, 4 of whom were slowly going blind at the end of their life. But there were 2 who suddenly went blind during the middle of their life. And those 2 both had diabetes. And one of them particularly, Neil Hans was his name, his story was so powerful, so impactful. At the age of 50, he went to bed one night with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes. And he talks about the last thing he remembers seeing before he went to sleep that night was his wife's beautiful face. And it just was such a heart-wrenching story. In fact, by the end of that interview, I was in tears, the sound engineer was in tears, the cameraman was in tears. We were all in tears, including the patient and his wife. And it was just one of those light bulb moments, I suppose, for me, that, wow, okay, this is quite staggering. And I started looking a bit more deeply at this, and I then realised that diabetes was the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults in Australia, in this country. Well, why is that? Well, about 1.7 plus million with diabetes, the majority of whom have type 2 diabetes, about 90% of cases. And more than half, probably well over half of this huge number of people with diabetes are not having their regular all-important sight-saving eye checks. And so that's why it's become such a blinding problem in our society. Something like 98% of the loss in vision and blindness due to diabetes, due to type 2 diabetes, or due to diabetes altogether, is preventable or treatable. So missing your eye checks is not a good thing. So, that was the next stage of the next piece of the puzzle. And then I was fortunate enough to receive a nomination for the South Australian chapter, I suppose, of Australian of the Year. Not expecting to win that, but preparing a speech. And when I did happen to win that award, I got up to make my speech, and it was all about the fact that diabetes is this significantly blinding disease in our society, and I wanted to encourage people to have their eyes checked. Then leading forward to the national ceremony in January last year, this is when I really started to dig deep and read. And I read a number of books which were really beginning to open my eyes to this problem of type 2 diabetes and the huge driver of a poor diet, and particularly sugar and ultra-processed foods. And so I really then, as I said, started to think about it more deeply. I even came up with the concept of why sugar in particular is such a toxic element in our society. And then that gave rise to the opportunity to deal with that toxic impact of sugar. And so this concept, I'm not sure if you've heard it, I call it the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. So just very briefly, the first A, addiction. So sugar is highly addictive, as addictive as nicotine. Second A, alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress or to make us feel better when we're down. Third A is accessibility. You can't check out from most supermarket stores, even post offices, chemists, without being enticed by half-price chocolates and soft drinks. Fourth A, addition. Something like 75% of our food and drinks have added sugar. And the fifth A is advertising. So we are bombarded by ads, TV commercials, social media ads, literally on a daily basis. So it was those 5 A's of sugar toxicity, that concept that I came up with prior to the Australia Day ceremony, that really gave me this deep understanding. And when I received my award, again, I wasn't expecting to win the award. I didn't think that they would give the award to 2 Adelaide doctors in a row, but fortunate for me, they did. And then my speech became about the critical issue of sugar in our diet, which I believe is a big driver of this. And so from that moment on, this world opened up to me, this enormous, extraordinary, multi-layered world. And really, I've learned so much even from that time, the reading, the people who've been able to mentor and guide me, and just deeply thinking about what we need to do to get out of this diabolical scenario we're in with our food environment and our chronic disease epidemic, which is man-made and largely related to our poor diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people would be maybe asking the question, how is the sugar that I'm consuming affecting my eyes? It doesn't seem like a very straightforward connection, because you consume sugar, it goes into your gut. So how would you explain that to someone, the relationship between sugar intake and eye health?
Yeah, and it's not that straightforward, but there are over 8,000 studies linking sugar consumption to a range of chronic diseases, including type 2 diabetes. But I like to talk about 3 main dietary components. The first being sugar, second being refined carbohydrates, which are essentially sugar in disguise, white rice, white flour, white potatoes, which are virtually pure starch. They break down into glucose when they reach our gut. So then basically that's just more sugar. And then the seed oils, which are also dangerous, they're inflammogenic, high in omega-6 fatty acids. And those 3 components are the major components of ultra-processed foods, or what I like to call ultra-processed food-like substances. But to me, it's the sugar element, which is so addictive and is so enticing in all of those ultra-processed foods. So it is a complex metabolic process. To try and keep it simple, there's two major outcomes on the eye. The first is damage to the fine blood vessels at the central vision area of the retina, what we call the macula, which is that fine tissue in our eyes, which is responsible for detecting the cues, the visual cues from the outside world, transmitting them back to the brain. So when you have damage to those fine blood vessels, you have leakage of fluid into the tissues of the macula, and that in itself can cause blurring and distortion of vision. The other thing is blockage of blood vessels in the retina, and you get a lack of oxygen flow, what we call ischemia, and that can trigger the growth of new blood vessels, neovascularization, or what we call proliferative diabetic retinopathy, and that can be devastating. That can lead to sudden bleeding inside the eye, rarely in both at the same time, like happened in Neil Hansel, but that bleeding can take away the eyesight, and in an instant, and sometimes permanently, as in the story of Neil Hansel. So those are the two main reasons for loss of vision in diabetes. And it's actually a combination of factors that give rise to this. The excessive consumption of sugar, refined carbohydrates, seed oils, ultra-processed foods ultimately leads to a condition called insulin resistance. And they can all independently give rise to insulin resistance. But when we are insulin resistant, we then start to see a rise of blood glucose. The liver converts that excessive glucose into fat, and ultimately then starts to take that fat on, and we develop what's called a fatty liver. And then the process goes on, and then ultimately when the liver cannot take any more fat on board, it then starts to export it away as triglyceride. And triglyceride is damaging to our body. So the insulin resistance gives rise to high insulin level in the blood. We have high glucose in the blood, and we have high triglyceride in the blood. And it's the combination of those three factors which are so damaging to the blood vessels throughout the body. So the combination of the high triglyceride and the high insulin leads to the formation of fatty plaques, which then block those blood vessels. The high glucose level independently gives rise to other changes, such as the loss of elasticity in red blood cells, damage to the cells, the fine cells that line our blood vessels, a number of other things. So you can see it's a combination of factors that ultimately give rise to the complications of type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, and I think coming along with that is usually an abnormality in lipid composition. We hear a lot about cholesterol as well. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears that there are cholesterol deposits in the eye when diabetes goes for several years or goes for too long. Why is cholesterol being deposited in the eye, and what is it doing there?
Yeah, it's not so much that cholesterol is being deposited in the eye, but so I mentioned about insulin resistance and the fatty liver, and what happens when we have this excessive, let's look at just the glucose element and the fructose element. So if we look at table sugar, which is the most common additive, that's sucrose, 50% glucose, 50% fructose. When it's really the fructose element of the sugar, of the sucrose, which is quite damaging, because nearly all of it's actually not recognized as a food by the body. It doesn't trigger the release of insulin. When glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, it does trigger the release of insulin from the pancreas. And it's interesting that immediately it hits the bloodstream, something comes out of the system to hide it or to move it out of the bloodstream. So clearly, in high levels in glucose is not good for us. It has its toxicity. So the body is trying to push that glucose into our cells, and we use that glucose for energy, or sometimes it's also stored as well. So fructose, however, as mentioned, not recognized as a food by the body, doesn't trigger the release of insulin, and it actually suppresses our appetite control. But when it's absorbed, nearly all of it is metabolized by the liver, and about a third of it is converted immediately to fat. much of which is then stored in the liver as a fatty liver. Also, the breakdown products of fructose can independently give rise to insulin resistance, mitochondrial dysfunction. So, as I say, there's trying to keep it as simple as possible, but it's that fructose element which is particularly toxic, and it's what we're consuming in bucket loads in sugary drinks and also ultra-processed foods. And what happens is that when we are insulin resistant, we do have a fatty liver. The fat that is created by the liver is actually predominantly the small, dense LDL or low density lipoprotein particles. Triglyceride really is a proxy for that, but it's the small, dense particles which are particularly damaging to the fine blood vessels and give rise to, in the presence of high insulin level, to the fatty plaques, which then block the blood vessels, and that in turn gives rise to the many life-changing and life-threatening consequences. So it's the small, dense particles of the LDL which are the problem, not what we call the large, fluffy particles, which are a very elegant way of the body transporting cholesterol throughout the body in the bloodstream. And cholesterol is incredibly important to our health and survival. It's a precursor hormone for our sex hormones. It makes up the walls of every cell of our body, and it has a number of other really critical functions in our body. If we didn't have cholesterol, we wouldn't be able to survive. So cholesterol is not the enemy. It's the small, dense LDL particles which are created by excessive consumption of sugar, seed oils, refined carbohydrates.
From your experience, is there a way to mediate or even reverse some of the damage that can be done by these processes by, eliminating all of these refined foods?
Yes, absolutely. So I often say that, excuse me, the type 2 diabetes is largely preventable and also potentially reversible. And the preventability and reversibility are, two separate issues. But if we're just talking about reversibility, some people prefer to say putting type 2 diabetes into remission. I have now over 100 patients that I'm actively treating with sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy, over 100. And when I started to realize early last year that this is a disease that can potentially be put into remission, can potentially be reversed, it wasn't until early this year, actually, that I then started to raise this with my patients and just simply ask them, did you realize that your type 2 can be potentially put into remission? And I think there was only one or two that actually were aware. So this message is not getting through to patients with type 2 diabetes, whether it's through their health practitioners, through their dietitians or nutritionists, or through diabetes associations. So the message is not getting through to a significant majority of the patients with this disease. So this is concerning in itself. So I then wrote back to the referring GP and say, can we please explore the opportunity to put this patient's type 2 diabetes into remission using a low carb or even a ketogenic diet? And interesting responses from GPs, endocrinologists, other physicians that deal with the consequences of type 2 diabetes. But we're now starting to see a number of patients coming out the other end who have been referred to the nutritionist who I recommended, who specializes in ketogenic diets. And we are now seeing patients who have put their diabetes into remission. They've initially come off their insulin, and they've come off their oral hypoglycemics, the oral diabetes medications. They've lost a bunch of weight, and they had quite literally put their type 2 diabetes into remission. One who had type 2 diabetes for 15 years, and she was actually angry. Why had no one told this to me before? So it is absolutely possible. The concern is, obviously it's dependent on the degree of damage to the pancreas. I mentioned before a fatty liver. A fatty pancreas is also an essential part of the metabolic process. And if we have significant damage to the cells of the pancreas, which secrete the insulin, then that may not be reversible. If the pancreas has become so scarred that it can no longer recover, then that is a concern, and we may see then no opportunity for reversal. So we can't promise all of our patients that this is a possible outcome for them. But if it's just simply atrophy of the beta cells, then they can recover and they can start to produce insulin again, and we can see type 2 diabetes then being reversed or going into remission. And we can see recovery of the pancreas, which is often shriveled and atrophied. So there is definitely an opportunity there for patients, but if it's really extreme and there's been severe end-stage damage to the pancreas, well, that may not be possible. But I think it's certainly worth giving it a go in pretty much everyone. And even if someone has type 1 diabetes, or if they have severely damaged pancreas, reducing the level of carbohydrate in their system is a good thing, can only be a good thing, because in essence, they are carbohydrate intolerant.
Definitely. That's, I think more people are becoming aware that these diabetic conditions are at least, we're capable of, winding the clock back a little bit and really potentially getting people off their insulin and lowering dosages of medication.
That's right. And, if we go through this pathway of insulin resistance to pre-diabetes to type 2 diabetes, then it's complications. It's a continuum. And at any point in time, you can stop, reverse that. It can only be a good thing. What I would sort of warn, I suppose, is that, if someone has lost vision, if we just look at the blinding complications, there's no guarantee that can be reversed. But it's something I'm looking at the moment to see whether actually putting a patient's type 2 into remission, whether ultimately we can see the retina start to repair itself and start to see some regression, let's say, of the retinopathy in the eyes. That would be a fabulous thing to see. And we also know that, unfortunately, 70% of patients with type 2 will develop dementia, 80% will die of a thrombotic episode such as heart attack or stroke, and then we have renal failure and a whole bunch of other things that can happen. So, I think it's fascinating to see, and we know already that going on to a low carbohydrate diet, the coronary artery calcium scores can reduce. So it's never too late, I think, to at least attempt to try and put type 2 diabetes into remission.
Absolutely. From your time in Kenya, did you notice that there's quite a distinct difference between their diets as well as the illnesses that they were coming in with? Do you see those two things as directly correlated from your experience over there?
No, so I mentioned before that mainly what I was seeing were infectious diseases. And if we wind the clock back to our own society 100 odd years ago, what were we dying of? They were mainly infectious diseases. So one of the huge public health successes, quite literally vaccinations and antibiotics, which has really turned around the epidemic of many infectious diseases that were the predominant cause of death back then. Seat belts and motor vehicle accidents was also a huge public health success. So it's so long ago now, I don't even recall, but I can't imagine I saw any patients with type 2 diabetes back then. And interestingly, I was involved in an adult blindness study in Myanmar in Southeast Asia in 2005. And we examined the eyes of over 2,000 people. And I don't believe and it was mainly a rural community, I don't believe there was any patients who had type 2 diabetes amongst that group. And we certainly didn't see any diabetic retinopathy. So when people are on their traditional diet, and particularly when they are not exposed to ultra-processed foods, which have become so prevalent in our society, they were eating mainly whole foods, real foods, in essence, fresh and healthy foods. And so that epidemic of diet-related diseases was not prevalent there. If we look at now what's being eaten in the United States, something like 62% of the calories come from ultra-processed foods. Children, 2/3 of their calories come from ultra-processed foods. In the United Kingdom, about 50%, and I think we're not far behind that 50% mark in Australia. So it's a really sad situation that we have this diabolical diet driven by the processed food industry, sugary drinks industry, which is so damaging to our health. And unfortunately, let's say in Asia, we're seeing this increasing sugar consumption. This is a population that has a diet that has been traditionally relatively high in refined carbohydrates in the form of white rice. But again, if we wind the clock back, the white rice that was being consumed was not highly processed, not highly refined. The portion sizes were probably a lot smaller, but also we're seeing this huge increase in consumption of sugar, something like 5% per year in Asia. So, and the increase of sugary drinks and ultra-processed foods, which when I'm traveling, I'm a keen photographer as well. And when I'm traveling in Asia, just everywhere you're seeing these ultra-processed foods and sugary drinks for sale, in addition to the obvious street foods that you can buy. But you go to a market in a rural town in Asia, in Africa, and it's just full of wonderful, fresh, healthy foods. That's what we should be eating. And I love Gary Fick. He's just very simple sentence of eat mainly whole, seasonal, local foods, which are relevant to your environment and to your cultural background, but avoiding sugar and ultra-processed foods. You can't go wrong if you stick to that mantra.
Yeah, I think it's a good distinction to make between sugar from whole foods, particularly things like fruit, and even things like whole grains as well that may be high in carbohydrates, but not accessible as nearly as quickly as refined foods. So is that a distinction that you make sure you give to patients? And, whilst it's probably not a good idea to have 10 pieces of fruit a day, 1 or 2 or even 3 pieces of fruit wouldn't be as damaging as sugar coming from a refined source.
Absolutely. So, I tend to not give dietary advice to my patients. I do leave that to the nutritionists and the dietitians that I'm aligned with. And but if we just look at, let's say, oranges, I recommend people eat whole orange, not the peel. Someone asked me whether I meant the peel, but no, not the peel, the whole orange. But what if you eat the whole orange minus the peel? You can only eat, 2 or 3 in one sitting, because the fiber content is satiating. It makes you feel full. So you can't overeat oranges or apples. When you squeeze the juice out, you pretty much leave the fiber behind. And so you can drink, plenty of fruit juice. But in essence, a glass of orange juice has nearly as much sugar as a glass of cola, for example. So it's pretty much a sugary hit. Yeah, it's got added vitamin C and other nutrients, but it also has that huge load of sugar. But the other really important thing is that the whole fruit and the fiber in the whole fruit slows down the absorption of the fructose element. So nature has packaged up the poison fructose with its antidote fiber. I like that analogy there, that we should be eating the whole fruit rather than the sugary juice. It's much healthier for you. And I tend to, if you're metabolically healthy, yes, then 2 or 3 pieces of whole fruit a day is very pleasurable. But if you're getting into the type 2 diabetes range, then I'd be really looking at more low sugar fruit rather than the tropical fruits, which are high sugar fruits.
Definitely. It's a very big problem that we're facing as far as, you mentioned the 5 A's. We really can't get away from these poisonous foods, and they happen to be quite cheap as well. So it becomes appealing to everyone, essentially. What do you see is the next step we should be making to reduce the impact of these foods on the health of our country?
Yeah, so I had this overarching A of action. So action is quite clearly needed when we have 1.7 with diabetes, 2 million with pre-diabetes, many of whom will go on to develop diabetes. 2/3 of Australian adults and 1/4 of our kids are overweight or obese. So the majority of us are not metabolically healthy. The majority of us have metabolic dysfunction. And there are some poorer parts of our society. Greater Western Sydney, for example, 50% of the adults over the age of 24 have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. So it is an alarming problem, a disease we're now seeing in our children as well, children as young as 3. So action is quite clearly needed. And so there's my next layer of A's. So I have 3 layers of A's: awareness, accountability, and assistance. And we can sort of tease apart these, and there's many layers here. So there's no one thing that will help. And within each of those A strategies, we can't just say one of those things will do the job. We really need to attack all of them at once. So awareness. Awareness of the preventability and reversibility of type 2 diabetes. And for patients who develop type 2 diabetes, many of them are not aware of the horrendous complications that potentially await them. Neil Hansel, I mentioned, the guy that went blind, had no idea. As well as being blind in both eyes, he has had 9 amputations. In fact, he had 9 amputations over a 14-month period ending in March last year when he lost his whole left leg. So amputation due to gangrene is the second most feared complication of type 2 diabetes, or of diabetes in its entirety. He's also had 2 heart attacks as well. He had no idea what was waiting for him. And I think this is a big, big problem. We used to see on TV those ads for the complications of smoking. We see nothing about the complications of type 2 diabetes. So awareness is critical. And also when we come to the preventability issue, if we look at our national dietary guidelines, which are currently up for review, or currently just started the review process, they continue to discourage the eating of natural saturated fats. They encourage the eating of those polyunsaturated seed oils, the vegetable oils that we euphemistically call them, and they encourage the eating of cereals and grains. So in essence, it's a high carb, low fat and low healthy fat eating pattern, which until we completely turn that round, we're not going to see type 2 diabetes being prevented in a large scale. So awareness is really, really important here. Accountability is also important, and accountability of businesses and industry, and ultimately our government to do the right thing by the people of Australia. And there's lots of examples of accountability, but this predatory marketing that goes on in our environment, at the checkout I mentioned before, even in chemists, we have half-price chocolates and soft drinks, alluring and addictive, just waiting for you there. So an accountability of the advertisement that goes on in our environment and the advertisement on TV and social media, which are targeting our children. There needs to be accountability here. And again, there's many more layers we can pick apart there, including the sort of levy on or a tax on sugary product, particularly sugary drinks. It's just one of many things. And we also need a clear and transparent labelling system on foodstuffs, telling us exactly how much added sugar is contained within, and not to disguise. There are 56 common names for sugar that are used on packages of food. And the final thing is assistance. And if we just look at medical practitioners, health practitioners, my son was in second year medicine last year. He had the opportunity to do nutrition science as an elective. Wasn't even compulsory. This is the biggest health crisis that we have. It's far bigger than COVID-19, and yet it's not even being taught in many of our major medical schools. And then we come to my colleagues, my general practitioner colleagues, my nutritionist and dietitian colleagues. They need the education, they need the resources, and particularly they need the time and the financial remuneration, the financial incentives to have these really critical discussions with their patients. And for me, one of the highlights of my medical career, I've had a number through my work with Sight for All, but one of the highlights in my medical career here in Australia is to see my patients with acutely vision-threatening diabetes-related eye disease coming back to me saying that their diabetes is now in remission. It's one of the most satisfying, rewarding things that I've ever experienced. And I want my general practitioner colleagues to have this experience. I want my endocrinologist colleagues to have this experience. I want my orthopedic surgeons, vascular surgeons, renal physicians to have this experience. It is so powerful and so wonderful.
Yeah, there's definitely a huge reason to be, putting a lot of energy behind this cause. I don't know if you have any figures off the top of your head, but I imagine that the overconsumption of these ultra-processed foods would be costing our country many millions of dollars in healthcare, in everything even beyond healthcare. Do you know how much the consumption of these ultra-processed foods costs us in the long run?
Yeah, the last estimate was quite some years ago. I think it was 2013 that type 2 diabetes was costing us about $15 billion a year. But I suspect now, several years later, it's around about the $20 billion mark. But if you realise that insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, metabolic dysfunction, type 2 diabetes is a big driver. I mentioned the complications of it, but the top 3 killers in our society are heart attack, dementia, and stroke. If you realise type 2 diabetes is a big driver of those, then I suspect metabolic dysfunction, and particularly diet-related metabolic dysfunction, is the biggest killer in our midst. It is also a driver of hypertension and also cancer as well. There are links between metabolic dysfunction and cancer. So I suspect if we factor in all of those other really critical chronic diseases, then I suspect the cost to our society, to the taxpayer, is manyfold higher, perhaps even approaching $100 billion. So I think if someone actually did a serious costing out of this, because what happens when someone passes away? If it's a heart attack, that's listed as the major cause, and then type 2 diabetes doesn't register then if they have it as the cause. But if we actually looked at all of the metabolic dysfunction across all the patients, then I think it would really push it right to the top. I'd be very interested to see that study.
Yeah, me too. I think these figures are probably what need to be used at a higher level to really promote these ideas. There are some Scandinavian countries and maybe some other ones in Europe that have a taxation model on sugar. Have you looked into how successful those taxation models have been?
Yeah, there are actually many countries, and there's lots of studies now. So there's certainly some strong evidence behind taxation. And it has been shown to reduce purchase and reduce consumption. I don't believe at this stage it's been shown to reduce the chronic disease epidemic. That will be some time down the track. But I think, as I mentioned before, it's only one piece of the puzzle. That in itself is not going to turn this around. It needs to be all of these things, including potentially warning labels on the packets of ultra-processed foods and all of those other things I mentioned. It has to be a multi-pronged strategy. Interestingly, when I received the award early last year, and I talked about the 5 A's of sugar toxicity, and I was being interviewed after receiving the award by journalists, and here we are in Canberra, political journalists, when the issue of a tax on sugar came up. That was the only thing that they focused on. And then in the papers in the days after, it was Dr. Muecke calls for a sugar tax. But I said, no, hang on, hold on. This is a multi-pronged strategy. That's only one piece. And if we just focused on that, no, we're not going to see it. We need to have that and everything else that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think education's got to be one of the most important as well, because, even when I was growing up, which wasn't that long ago, we didn't have that much access. I know in my house we didn't have soft drinks, and those sort of treats just weren't super available. But nowadays it's become even worse, and I really get concerned for the next generation, because kids don't know what the downstream effects are going to be, and they certainly aren't up to making those decisions. And I think it's extremely difficult for adults as well to make these decisions, because maybe they don't know about the possible consequences either. But another thing I wanted to ask you about was other ways in which, aside from diet, that we can help with eye health. I know the eyes are a very metabolically demanding part of the brain, and there's quite a bit of research going on with photobiomodulation and using light, and the dangers of screen time with the high blue content. How much work do you do with light with people's eyes?
To be honest, Cameron, I don't deal with that at all, so I can't comment on that. But what I do know, so the leading cause of blindness worldwide is cataract. It isn't the leading cause of blindness in high-income countries. Now, let's say Australia being a high-income country, the leading cause of blindness in elderly people is a condition called age-related macular degeneration. The leading cause of blindness amongst working-age adults is diabetic retinopathy, diabetes-related eye disease. And there's a lot of work being done on age-related macular degeneration by Chris Kenobi, K-N-O-B-B-E, in the United States. He swears that macular degeneration is being driven by the seed oils, and particularly our ultra-processed food environment. So if we realise then the leading cause of blindness in Australia, macular degeneration, the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults, diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes, both diet-related. And then if we look at the fact that cataract is still a significant problem, and we know that there's cataract is more prevalent in people with type 2 diabetes, then nutrition is driving much of our loss of vision and blindness in this society, I think. And if we look at, our overall health and well-being, our poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than smoking, alcohol, and inactivity combined. Yes, we need to exercise. I think exercise is critical for our health, particularly for our mental health. Yes, we need to reduce our consumption of alcohol, and really smoking should not be something we do at all. So those are all important, but diet trumps it by a mile. And so really diet is the thing that we should be focusing on the most to turn this epidemic of vision-related and chronic health disease in our society.
Cool. What's happening at the level of the eye when as we age, we might need a new pair of glasses or a new prescription? What's happening in the eye that's that's requiring us to have an extra lens to help put things in focus?
Yeah, that's something that happens in pretty much everyone as we age, and it usually starts in our early 40s, and it's called presbyopia. So the lens of the eye is crystal clear, and it is flexible, and there's muscles and fibrils that pull on the lens to help focus up close. But once we reach our early 40s, the lens starts to harden, and the muscles can't pull the lens into a shape to allow us to focus up close. So that's when we start to move the reading material, for example, further away from us. But it gets to a stage where your arms quite simply aren't long enough, and the print gets too small to be able to see it. And so what you need then is essentially a magnifying glass. And what reading glasses are, if you don't have any other glasses area in your eyes, is simply a magnifier to bring the reading material closer to you. So that's in essence what happens, and it starts in our early 40s, goes through to mid-60s. By the time we've reached our mid-60s, the lens is not flexible anymore, and so you need a fixed set of reading glasses, which will then pretty much take you through to the rest of your life. But many of us, in fact, virtually all of us, will develop a cataract if we live long enough. And cataract surgery is, as I mentioned, it's a beautiful, elegant, sophisticated operation, but it restores sight in the vast majority of people within a day or two. It is quite extraordinary and wonderful to see. But at this point in time, we usually have a fixed focus lens. We can either fix it for the distance. We can also see multifocal lenses, which allow people to see in the distance, but also see up close. But they're working on, at the moment, a lens which will hopefully be flexible and then allow that focusing without the need for glasses as we were before our early 40s. So that's something that hopefully we'll see down the track. There's a lot of research going into that, because that would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah, definitely. That's fascinating. One thing I've been really interested in is this idea that in our evolutionary past, we would have only been exposed to natural light, which is always rich in infrared and far infrared. Whereas today, as soon as we go inside, that infrared portion gets chopped off precipitously, and the lights that we use are rich in blue and green. Is there an impact on the way the lens molds based on the irradiance of light that we get in our eyes, and perhaps over time the subtraction of great amounts of infrared could be causing the muscles to become fatigued?
Yeah, very interesting question, Cameron. So I've been involved in a number of childhood blindness studies and refractive error or glasses error studies in Asia. And one of the really interesting ones was from Laos, some years ago, where we examined children from the Vientiane province. Vientiane is the capital of Laos. And there are 20-odd schools that we visited in that study, and quite a significant number of children who are in their early teens, from memory. And what we actually, the results of that study showed a group of children who had the best vision in the world, published at that time, which was roughly 10 years ago. Prior to that, it was kids from Aboriginal communities in Australia, which had fantastic vision. And when we went back and looked at those schools, I think there was only one or two that actually had a library. So I wondered whether just quite simply the fact that they weren't reading was somehow contributing to this. But since that time, and we actually then went on and did a similar study in Cambodia where we compared children at schools from urban areas versus rural areas, and we found that the kids from rural areas had better vision. In essence, they had a lesser degree of short-sightedness or myopia. But then if we look at, so that kind of reinforced my thinking that it was children getting outdoors, being out in nature, versus children who were always indoors, reading, looking at things, which was somehow driving this. And we know in cities like Hong Kong, Beijing, there's a very, very high level or high prevalence of short-sightedness or myopia. But I understand, and I haven't looked at the recent data, but I understand that yes, time spent outdoors is absolutely related to this. So the more time spent outdoors, the less risk of myopia. But I believe it's related to ultraviolet exposure. So if we're not being exposed to ultraviolet light by being outdoors, this can somehow lead to the weakening of the outer coats of the eye, leading to expansion of the eye, and that can then lead to short-sightedness or myopia. So I suspect it's something like that, but it may well be a lot more complicated with underlying genetic issues as well as environmental issues like many of these diseases. So I can't give you the full picture on it, but that is perhaps part of the story there.
That's fascinating. I didn't think about the UV aspect of it. How permeable is the lens of the eye to UV light? Because I've heard some people say it's impermeable, but then I've also heard that maybe about 1% to 2% of the UV gets through the lens.
Yeah, again, Cameron, I can't give you the data on that. So yeah, I can't let you know about that. But certainly the lens of the eye does have a filter in it for sure.
Right. Okay. I'm sure you probably know of some specific nutrients in food that are particularly useful for maintaining eye health and color determination as well. I've heard that the most densely packed part of the body with omega-3 fats is the retina. Is this something that you think could be used? Fish consumption is quite low, and do you think that those two things might be related?
Cameron, you seem to know more about the eye than I do. You've obviously been doing your reading very, very good. No, I wasn't aware of that. I've been so focused on type 2 diabetes that I haven't been focusing on that. But what is interesting, I mentioned before, I think I mentioned that I was involved in an adult blindness study in Myanmar, as well as finding very low level of, or no diabetes-related eye disease and no cases of type 2 diabetes. We also found, and at that point, we published a number of papers, but the lead paper showed the highest prevalence of blindness in the world. It was something like 8% or over 8% of presenting blindness in people over the age of 40, which is quite staggering. Nearly 1 in 10 were blind, and the vast majority of those were blind due to cataract. And I was in my early 40s at the time, and I was seeing people in that study who were younger than me, who were 40, 41, 42, who were visually impaired, even blind due to cataract. It's just something we don't see here. And then I mentioned before that I am a keen photographer. So before we started the study each day, I would go out and photograph in the village and go out into the fields. And I saw the farmers slaving away, with plows being towed by bullocks, and they were absolutely skinny, but they were sweating and they were dehydrating themselves, and I suspect weren't replenishing their hydration with fresh water. And I think my theory after that was that patients were in a chronic state of dehydration. People were in those villages where it was a very hot area of central Myanmar, quite dry, and they were in a chronic state of dehydration. Possibly added to that were acute or subacute episodes of gastrointestinal illnesses, which then exacerbated the dehydration. And I wonder whether this state of dehydration exacerbated by acute episodes was somehow driving this formation of cataract, rather than any lack of nutrient they had in their diet, that they had in their rice, for example. But that was something we were also going to go back and have a little look at, but haven't as yet. So I can't tell you for sure whether that nutrient or plays a role in this. But I think the bottom line is, avoiding ultra-processed foods, sugary foods, seed oils, refined carbohydrates as much as possible can only be a good thing for our health.
Definitely, for sure. There's a big culture in Australia of wearing sunglasses outside. I was wondering where you landed on that debate, whether we should be, as soon as we step outside, putting sunglasses on, or should we be spending some time to let some high-intensity sunlight in? Like you said, there does seem to be a beneficial aspect of being out in nature, whether it's the, seeing far and wide and that forward ambulation, having things going past you, as well as the light. But do you recommend people let some light in rather than always wearing sunglasses outside?
Exactly, and I think that early morning sun is critical, and getting out there before the sun is too high in the sky, because that's when it becomes more dangerous. Certainly that early morning sun's filtered by a significant layer of atmosphere, so it's not as harsh, it's not as potentially damaging to our skin, to our eyes. And I know myself, so I'm actually an eye cancer specialist. That was my main subspecialty. And I have one of the largest series in the world of eye cancer on the surface of the eye. Most people wouldn't have even heard of it. But the majority of my patients who had the cancer on the surface of the eye were people who worked outdoors, particularly farmers in rural communities in South Australia. And many of them, I suspect, when they were younger, were not wearing a hat, not wearing sunglasses. So generally with patients who actually have significant sun damage on the surface of the eyes, and particularly if patients have had little cancer on the surface of the eyes that I've treated, I recommend that they wear a wide brim hat, particularly when they're out in the harsh light of the midday sun, and dark glasses, ultraviolet protective glasses in that harsh sun is probably quite sensible to reduce the chance of that happening. I think a good hat is a really good thing to wear in the middle of the day, keep the sun off the face, and certainly many of those farmers also had significant cancers and sun damage to their skin of their face, and we don't want to see that as well. So it's a balance, really, isn't it, between having that exposure to sun in the morning versus exposure to the very harsh, potentially damaging sun during the middle of the day.
Is this the cancer of the eye? Is that an ocular melanoma?
No. So the commonest cancers that I treat in children is a condition called retinoblastoma, and that's due to a genetic mutation. We don't know the underlying causes of that as yet. In adults, the commonest cancers that I see in the eye are what I mentioned before, cancer on the surface of the eye, which is actually squamous cell carcinoma, or there's a lesion called squamous neoplasia or dysplasia, which is basically a precursor to squamous cell carcinoma on the surface of the eye. We do see melanomas on the surface of the eye, but they're very rare, and they tend to arise in another pathological setting called primary acquired melanosis, and that is not related to sun exposure. The commonest cancer inside the eye that we see, there are two. One is melanoma of the uveal, UVEAL, the uveal tissue, which is the tissue beneath the retina. So the choroidal melanoma, ciliary body melanoma, iris melanoma. And the other thing we see is secondary cancer spreading from primary cancers elsewhere in the body, and ending up primarily in the uvea, or particularly the choroid. So choroidal metastasis in women, breast cancer, in men, lung cancer particularly. So those are the commonest cancers, and I don't believe there's a definite link to ultraviolet exposure, sun exposure, to melanoma inside the eye. In fact, we see melanomas. There was a case that was going around amongst my colleagues just this week in a teenager seeing a melanoma inside the eye. So occasionally that does happen. Fortunately, it's pretty rare, But we can see melanomas arising in kids, almost certainly not related to chronic ultraviolet exposure.
That's fascinating. I wasn't aware of all of the different types of cancers that you can get of the eye.
And they're more still, but they're all pretty rare.
Yeah, well, thankfully they're rare. Where do you see your work going from here? What are you involved in most heavily at the moment?
Well, interestingly, myself, I have a neurological condition impacting on my right hand function, my dominant hand function, which I inherited from Dad, which is a little frustrating. I actually had to give up surgery back in 2016. I actually gave up cataract surgery in 2012, but it's now impacting on my day-to-day work. Not so much any skill level, but a constant discomfort in fact, I can feel it now in my elbow and my hand, because I have no control over how hard I hold things with my right hand. So it's just a chronic state of contraction in my hand, which is impacting on my ability to examine patients and to do most things with my right hand. So it's frustrating. So I'm actually looking at a succession plan at the moment, and most likely will be retiring in the next few months. So before I actually received the award, the South Australian Award, a couple of years, I realised that this was on the horizon. So I was already starting to look at the next phase of life. So I was looking at the opportunity to do some keynote speaking. I've been involved in producing and creating a number of short films. So I wanted to get involved in documentary production. I wanted to write a book, which all of these things I'm actually doing at the moment. And so I already have a little bit of a game plan. But I also want to continue doing my work in a voluntary capacity for Sight for All. Also my work advocating around chronic disease epidemic. I currently spend about 40 or 50 hours a week on that alone, in a pro bono, in a voluntary capacity. So no doubt I'll keep myself busy in the next stage of life, but a little sad to leave my clinical career behind, but I won't be leaving medicine behind. And I'm actually really looking forward to the next stage of life.
That's fantastic. I'm sure you've got plenty of people who are looking forward to what you're going to be pursuing next. Particularly if there's a book on the way, I think lots of people will be interested. And yeah, I think there's lots of people out there who are very, very grateful for your work and sort of bringing this problem to the foreground, because it is a big problem. And yeah, it's good to have someone like you behind it. So yeah, we're all very grateful for it.
Thank you, Cameron. I mean, the more voices, the better. I mean, this is a movement. If it's not coming from top down, it has to come from ground up. It needs to be a grassroots movement. And I'm currently in the process of setting up a network of people working in this space to ultimately have that systemic change, that systematic impact. So I'll be launching that very soon, and really excited to share that, because I think it's that's going to ultimately be able to weave everyone involved in this space together to move this forward and ultimately to turn this chronic disease epidemic around. So it's not a quick, easy fix. I mentioned before, that's my personality. I like a quick, easy fix. And I realised that that's not the case. I was hoping I would have solved all sorts of problems during my year as 2020 Australian of the Year, but there's a lot longer to go, and I'm under no illusion that this is going to take decades. I mean, smoking-related diseases, smoking epidemic took decades to turn around, because there's so many vested interests trying to stop those voices and that action. And so this is actually bigger than the tobacco industry, bigger than the smoking disease epidemic that we had. So it's going to be a lot of work ahead of me, I suspect.
Yeah, well, what I'll do is I'll make sure I put all of your projects, links to all of your projects in the notes for this episode. So if people want to help out or keep in touch with you, they can. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on to talk to me today. Hopefully this can help your voice be heard a little bit more.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity, Cameron, and thank you for all you're doing as well. I think the more of us out there spreading these important messages, the better. So thank you for everything you do as well.
Cheers, James. Take care.
See you, Cameron. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you want to keep up with my work, you can find me using @RicciFlowNutrition on social media. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.